Okay, so I think that we're live now. I just want to welcome everybody for coming to our webinar. We're delighted you could attend, and we think that we'll get a few more people joining shortly. So this is just an introduction from me. I'm Tim Anderson-Edward. Today we're going to be looking at how to get more from self-assessments of the effectiveness of audit, risk and compliance. And I'm joined by one of our founding partners, Richard Sheath. So today we'll be focusing on how you can address and perhaps overcome some of the well-recognized issues in using questionnaires to see how well your audit, risk and compliance functions are working, how they are supporting the business and how they're adding value. We will start with a couple of housekeeping items. We'll be conducting polls today. So we do encourage you all to answer them. They're completely anonymous. And you will be able to ask questions at any time that we'll collect at the end by using the chat box at the bottom of the webinar window on usually the right-hand side of your screens. If you want to minimize that window to give you a better view, just click on the white arrow, which is in the orange box. So for now, I would like to introduce Richard Sheath, one of our founding partners, to give a brief introduction. Hi, Richard.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning. As many of you will already know, Independent Audit are leading providers of board evaluations. We've been doing them now for some 16 years or so. But what we also do is look at the effectiveness of other things that a board needs to depend on. So looking at the effectiveness of internal audit, external audit, risk management, risk culture, that sort of thing. So we do a lot of thinking around how you actually can assess the effectiveness of those things. And one of the things that we see in our board reviews, which is often quite disappointing, is a lack of really rigorous approach by the committees, whether that be the audit committee or the audit risk committee, a lack of a rigorous approach to these effectiveness reviews. It has improved, and we see a lot better reviews of internal audit, for example. But often these approaches from the committees to the requirement to conduct these effectiveness reviews is just not very rigorous. It's not very thought through. Too often it's dependent on perceptions or the view in the committee room rather than based on evidence from reaching out into the business. Also, we find often they're too focused on process and not really looking at how the business actually thinks or the business's perception of effectiveness. So really that means two things. One is that possibly the committees aren't meeting their responsibilities to undertake a well-structured or rigorous review. But more importantly, perhaps, it's also a lost opportunity in the sense that if these reviews are done properly, then they actually identify opportunities for audit, risk and compliance to actually help the business. So we think it's really important that committees actually take a different approach to this. And what we're going to do over the next 40 minutes or so is just take you through an approach we've developed to assessing the effectiveness of audit, risk and compliance. One which takes into account what stakeholders across the organisation are thinking, but also provides models to help committees actually structure their thinking and structure their effectiveness reviews. And then we're also going to touch on how to do this using questionnaires in a more effective way so that those self-assessments are actually adding a lot more.
Well, they're adding a lot more value, we hope. We're going to start this with a poll. It shouldn't take very long. Please, in fact, given the time limits, don't take too long. And we're just starting the poll now, which is on your screen. And we're just going to wait for a second while you select your answers. Okay, we're getting some results coming through now. Okay, it's quite interesting what we're seeing. The results, I think, yeah, they seem to be in. So, Richard,
so based on 85, how many people are actually on the webinar too?
I think we've got about 20 or so at the moment.
Okay, so from those 20, and most of you have voted, what we're actually finding is that only 6% of you are satisfied, very satisfied with the approach you take. Only half of you are satisfied that what you do is okay, but almost half, everybody else is saying we could do a lot more. So hopefully, as we run through this, this will help give you guidance on maybe how you can do that bit more if you're in that respondent group.
Okay, so to get us started, Richard, and we're going to start by focusing on risk management. What are the sorts of issues that people could find helpful in thinking through its effectiveness?
Well, here on the screen, you've got the model that we've put together to help people think through risk management effectiveness. Where we're coming out on this is too often people look at risk management as a process. So when they look at the effectiveness of it, they're looking at the question, do we have something that looks like an enterprise-wide risk management process or framework? And does it look like the one that a lot of other people have? And many committees actually just conclude that actually, if they've got that, then they must have an effective risk management process. But really the question needs to be, is it effective? Is it actually having an impact on how we run the business? Because that's really the question of how, whether or not you've got an effective risk management system. If it's not having an impact, then clearly it can't be effective. So in order to help committees think through that, what we've put together is this model. You start at the top and it goes clockwise from there. So the first thing to think about and ask people about is the risk management system actually linked to the strategic direction? Often when we look at risk management effectiveness, companies tell us that, or risk management functions even tell us that what they're missing is actually a good understanding of the strategy, clarity around what the strategy is, and then thinking through how the risk management needs to connect to that. So the strategic direction and clarity around that, the strategic context, needs to be the starting point. Then, moving clockwise, the question is, what sort of risk management framework do you have? Now, this is where people typically look at effectiveness, because they're looking at the process, they're looking at the risk management framework, what people actually do to identify, assess, and manage the risks in terms of how that's described as a process. So you still need to look at that. But then there's many other aspects to risk management working effectively that often are not considered. The next one, moving round, is behavior and culture. Now, everybody knows that good risk management depends on having the right behaviors. But when it actually comes to committees assessing the effectiveness of risk management, very rarely do they extend that to looking at how people actually use the risk management processes, how they respond to risk, what their attitudes towards risk and control are, that sort of thing. So in order to answer the question, is our risk management effective, you really do need to ask people about their attitudes and how they actually behave. Next, it's the question of management monitoring. Again, people often say, well, risk management has to happen at the coalface. It's what happens at the operating level. It's risk management has to be at the first line of defense. But often they don't look at that. They look at the process, but they don't actually ask management, how do you actually use the risk management processes in your day-to-day work? Now, how does the management monitoring of risk and risk management actually work in practice? So you need to reach that as well. And then just the last area we say is, well, risk management is effective if it's stopped bad things happening, or it has actually helped us make good decisions and help make things go right. But rarely do we see committees, or for that matter, the senior management, looking at what actually happened and how did our risk management actually help us in this, whether that's bad things that went wrong and the risk management didn't work as effectively as it might, or actually things that really went well, and what sort of role risk management actually played in making sure things did go right. And so to us, there's quite big areas: culture, behavior, management monitoring, assessing what actually happened and drawing learnings from that are often not taken into account in the assessment of the effectiveness of risk management. So hopefully this simple model that we've provided here will give the committee a better framework for thinking through that question.
Richard, thank you. Just a quick note of housekeeping. I've noted that one or two of you might not be able to see the bottom of the screen. We will be sending the slides out a bit later. You're not missing out on too much, I assure you. Richard, so look, it's really helpful to hear about the ways that risk management can impact on the business. But how can the board add more value in this area, and what should it be focusing on?
So again, when we do our board reviews, often we're a bit surprised how few boards are actually really getting much value from the time they spend looking at the principal risk list, or in committee, perhaps they're looking at the risk management reports. And I think often they haven't really stood back and actually asked themselves, what do we as a board need to do? And how can we use our time on risk management much more effectively? So again, we've put a model together here, and what I should have said at the outset is actually that underlying all of this, we've got detailed questionnaires that address each of these different parts of the model. But if we take this next model we've got here on risk governance, and around looking at the question, how much value is the board really asking for getting from its work around risk? And again, starting at 12 o'clock, we feel that what boards should be doing as part of their risk governance is really making sure they understand the model of the organization, what really drives this organization, what are the core processes. And if they haven't got a good understanding of that model, then it's difficult for them really to look at risk management and really ask whether that's working and whether the risks are actually really being identified and evaluated properly. So making sure that the board has got this fundamental understanding of risk, of the business model. Then moving clockwise, connected to that, standing back, using their time to actually assess the resilience of the organization. What are the things that really could go wrong here? And how able is the organization to respond to those things? So again, the questionnaire will be asking the board and others who interact with the board, how good is this board at actually really discussing the resilience of the organization and identifying those things that could really go wrong? And moving around, often, again, it's the same point I made earlier. Everybody knows that good risk management is dependent on the behaviors. So similarly, when the board thinks about risk, often it needs to look much more at the behavioral actors, the human factor aspects of the way risk is being taken. And also, when it comes to operational risk, how is behavior actually impacting the level of risk throughout the organization? One way I often like to refer to this is actually the board sitting back and asking itself, how far are our expectations surviving contact with people? Because too often a board is actually assuming that in risk taking in the organization, people are actually working in line with what the expectations of the board. But we all know that when it actually gets into the hands of individuals, things are interpreted differently, people behave differently, and the board can't necessarily rely on that. So this question of building in behavior into the board's consideration of risk taking is crucial. Then moving around, how is the board actually discussing whether a risk is acceptable? Too often now we see this focus on the list of 10, 12 principal risks. We don't hear so much discussion anymore around risk appetite and really how that fits into strategy, but then how that is actually translated into regular discussion in the boardroom. So we think boards should be actually looking at the way that when they are making decisions, when they are debating issues across the agenda, the question of, is the risk inherent here acceptable to us? Very often we see boards looking at it just once or twice a year, often when the principal risk list is produced, which is far too much of a process, rather than building risk into the board's discussions. And then lastly, how far is the board actually asking about the way the organization is actually responding to the main risks? So the board may well be identifying the risks, discussing the principal risk list, but does it then take it to the next stage to really understand how the organization is responding to those principal risks? Or is the board just seeing their discussion as the end of a process? So there's a lot more here to think about in terms of how a board is actually working, spending its time around risk. And hopefully this model of questions that are being raised can actually be used to enable you in your self-assessments to stand back and really make sure that the board is thinking through its approach to risk.
Thank you, Richard. So you've talked through about how a sort of a refocusing of risk management and how the board thinks about risk can lead to business benefits. And you've touched on it twice now. So, and it's always a question we do face. How does that translate into the day-to-day work? It's what people actually do that matters, isn't it?
Right. So the next area we want to look at is risk culture. And how does a board, how does a committee get confidence that the risk culture of the organization is what it thinks it is? Now, this, if you like, is a bit of a subset of a broader question of, how does a board actually get confidence that the culture or the behaviors of the organization are what they expect? We actually find it useful to narrow that down a bit and think particularly in terms of risk culture, attitudes towards risk taking, how people actually work together on a day-to-day basis in terms of managing the risks. And so this model helps people to actually think through that. So again, starting at 12 o'clock, it's really important to understand to what extent people feel the expectations around risk are actually explained effectively to them. And we all talk about risk appetite, but for most people across the organization, that's quite a difficult concept to relate to. So the question is, if you want people to behave in a particular way in relation to risk, are you actually helping them understand your expectations, how much risk you want them to take, what you want their attitude towards risk management, risk taking, behaviors? Have they understood what you really want to see from them and what you want to achieve? So the starting point is actually to ask people, do you really understand what our expectations are? How well do we communicate them? Moving clockwise around, the next area is actually asking people how they factor doing the right thing, behaving appropriately, managing risk, how they factor all those things into their day-to-day decision-making, their day-to-day work. Often we just assume that it happens. That probably isn't a fair assumption. We need to understand what they actually do in practice. And you get to that by actually asking them about their day-to-day work, not in a theoretical compliance type way, but actually just asking them how it relates to what they do. Moving around, also it's a question of communication, making sure we're explaining to them what good behavior looks like and making it clear. Moving around further, clockwise, then it's a question, we're asking people about what they actually see on a day-to-day basis. What we mean by that is asking people how they work with their colleagues. If you ask an individual, how far do you comply with this risk management process, policy, guidance, they're likely to say fully. If you ask them more about what they see happening across their team or what they see in terms of what their colleagues are doing, they're much more likely to open up. So I'll give you a live example on this, actually something we saw quite recently, which was a financial services organization, actually not in the UK, but elsewhere. And the question was asked around in relation to IT security and people's attitudes to that. And everybody, the positive results were coming in very positively about their own compliance, and they're saying, yes, we follow all the procedures, etc. But then actually when you ask the question, what do you see other people doing? Quite quickly it started emerging and getting comments talking about how people share passwords or they go on holiday and leave a password behind. And so that automatically started ringing alarm bells. Okay, so when people are talking about themselves, things are good, the picture is rosy, and they start talking about how they work with others or what behaviors they see amongst others, suddenly you start surfacing weaknesses. So it's important to ask questions around what you see, not what you do. And then lastly, the area of how people feel the risk management is and the risk culture is made to stick in the organization. So how are people actually encouraged, motivated to making it work? But what do they see in terms of the discouraging of bad behaviors or weaknesses? And because if people get messages from on high with policies and instructions, and then they don't see them actually being followed on the ground, then very quickly they become undermined, less meaningful. So it's important to understand people's perceptions of how things are being made to stick. So again, here's a model for you to help you think through what sort of questions do you actually need to be asking to actually assess the risk culture of the organization. As I mentioned earlier, we've got quite a few questionnaires supporting this sort of thing, but this at least will give you a framework to develop your own thinking as well.
Richard, thanks very much. We've looked now at how organisations can take a different approach to risk and embed that within the business. But what about compliance? Surely that's just a matter of keeping an eye on the technical delivery. How does that become more relevant?
But again, there's two ways of looking at this. You could just look at the technical delivery. You can look at the structures of the compliance function, the resources, the way it communicates compliance requirements to the organisation from their point of view, i.e. from the point of view of the compliance function itself. And it can assess that it is covering the ground and it's fully up to speed with changes in regulation, that sort of thing. But if you could look at it from a different point of view and say, actually, how useful is compliance to the rest of the organisation? What do people who need the support of compliance or need to rely on compliance, what do they think about the level of service they get from compliance? Because if they're not satisfied, then a conclusion as to it being effective it probably isn't very well grounded. So what you need to do is get out there and ask the business of their experience of working with compliance. So again, starting up at the 12 o'clock-ish, how far do the people who need to work with compliance or rely on compliance set out what they expect? What's their view on how far compliance is actually doing what they need it to do? And then moving around, what's their opinion on how far compliance actually have the right people? Have the right people to actually give the right advice at the business level? You might have people who are quite well qualified from a legal or regulatory viewpoint, but are they actually able to understand the needs of people at the coalface, of people in the business? Then also asking people out there in the business, is compliance really focused on the right things? Are they actually showing a good understanding of the business issues? Are they good at putting it in a strategic focus? Are they good at actually understanding the operational challenges on a day-to-day basis? So therefore, is compliance actually well focused from the point of view of the business, or is actually more just focused on what compliance think actually matters? Then there's the question about how they work together, so how compliance actually works with the business, the day-to-day interaction, the communication, the support. And then lastly, the question of the impact. Has the work of compliance actually helped us as management, or as people who have as officers of the organisation, or people who have to get insight and support from compliance on a day-to-day basis? Are compliance actually helping us make better decisions? I think these aspects of, is it compliance actually making a difference? Is it actually helpful? Are often neglected. Often, again, committees assessing compliance effectiveness will look at the structures, the processes, but not go as far as actually saying, well, is it actually achieving what it needs to achieve? And is that the view that's shared across the business?
Thanks, Richard. Moving on now, committees have been looking at the effectiveness of internal audit for some time. How can that be changed?
Well, again, it's really just a question of making sure that it's well structured. Generally, there's a lot of focus, and this is now well covered, in terms of looking at internal audit's compliance with international internal audit standards. But again, it's a question of getting out into the business. So just very briefly, because I don't want to keep on just repeating this, walking around the model wheel, because you can see how it works yourselves. But again, just initially find out what the organisation expects from internal audit, and then follow that through with how far of internal audit actually got the right people to meet those expectations of the business. So this isn't internal audit saying we have the right people. This is asking the organisation, do internal audit have the right people? Because if not, then their effectiveness is likely to be undermined. Asking people out in the business, what's your experience of working with internal audit teams? Do they actually have the knowledge or the understanding of the processes, of the business, of the risks? Or is it all driven by the audit plan or by the audit library? Then again, looking at the relationships, how does that work day-to-day basis? Then question of helping how the organisation actually helps internal audit think it through and actually come up with plans that are relevant to the business. And then just lastly, what does it feel like to be on the other end of the audit? Are they doing it right? Are they delivering high quality audits? Are the findings actually useful? Are they actually pulling out learnings from across the organisation? Are thematic issues being addressed? Are root causes being highlighted? Is that, if so, then those sort of the audit reports, the audit findings are much more likely to be useful to the business. So why don't you ask them, are they useful? And ask a large number of stakeholders how valuable they find the work of internal audit. That's the sort of question that needs to be asked around effectiveness, not simply audit process planning and numbers.
Thanks, Richard. Finally, how can the approach to assessing the external audit process be improved?
Well, again, the last 5 years or so, I've seen a big improvement in how audit committees are doing this in general, partly because the audit firms themselves are providing some reasonably good questions for audit committees to ask. So I think with this, it's really a question of making sure that you have factored in sufficiently the questions of communication, interaction, and understanding. In our model, starting at the top, planning, looking at the right things. Often this is actually covered quite well in the questionnaires provided by the Big Four. But then much less so is the next point around behaviour and actually asking people who have interaction with the auditors, their experience of working with them. Are they being professional? Are they being curious? Do they actually understand the business? So these are much softer questions that don't necessarily come through in your typical questionnaire. Also questions around how they work with people on a day-to-day basis during the audit, and for that matter, actually during the time when the audit isn't actually that live, but just keeping in touch with them during the rest of the year. And also, audits work well, particularly well if there is value. How far actually are the external auditors really adding value through their findings? So you're not necessarily talking here just about the financial statements, but more about the internal control related findings and actually helping business tackle certain risk or control issues. Because if that's working well, then often that provides very strong extra support for the rest of the audit. And then just often this question of doing the job in terms of does the audit actually go smoothly. Again, the Big Four questionnaires often pick this up quite well, but it's important to ask the people on the receiving end. And sometimes what we see is those questions from the Big Four simply being asked of the finance function and not reaching out into the wider organisation so that the people who are being audited actually have an opportunity to give their view.
Richard, thanks very much indeed. We've covered a lot of ground, of course, and we've got some fresh ideas about how you can take a different lens, if you like, to the effectiveness of audit risk and compliance. But in building the picture of how they are working, organisations are going to rely on questionnaires at some point. And there are some widely recognised downsides to a questionnaire approach. So let's now turn our attention and talk about how you can overcome some of those limitations.
As some of you might be aware, at Independent Audit, we have a self-assessment service called Thinking Board, and this reaches out into the areas of audit risk and compliance that we've been talking about. It's not just a board effectiveness review tool. And what you've got in front of you here is just an example screen from Thinking Board. And what we want to just point out here is the importance of making the questions work well, whether you're using our system or whether you're just coming up with questions for yourselves. Often a problem with questionnaires is they simply ask a question and ask for a rating without really explaining very well what the question actually means. And we overcome that by using the structure you see in front of you. On the right-hand side, we've got for each question what we describe as issues. So these are the things on the right-hand side under the heading we could do better at. And when we use questionnaires, our Thinking Board questionnaires, we actually ask people to score the question, but only after having considered the issues on the right-hand side. And this achieves various things in terms of overcoming typical problems with questionnaires. Firstly, often when there's just the question, people interpret that question in a different way, or maybe they simply don't understand the question, or they just don't think it through. And any of those problems actually rather invalidate the results. So we feel it works much better to actually give them some pointers, or not exactly pointers, but things to think through before they answer the question. In practice, what we find is this actually gets people much more engaged and find the questionnaires much more interesting because you're helping them through a thought process rather than just asking them a question to score. So it gets them more engaged, and also we find that it actually provokes comments. So often, as you'll know, but using questionnaires, often it's the comments that are more useful, and this actually leads to more comments. And the other thing in our system, if you were using our system, you'd actually get a report which indicates how many people have actually flagged these issues. So you might get a report saying 7 out of 10 actually thinks one of these issues is a problem. So just by adopting that different structure, in our view, that really helps overcome a lot of the disadvantages of typical questionnaires.
Indeed, especially, Richard, if you've got people, in different roles and different positions in different countries, and different entities, etc. So what we've got now, possibly, is a lot of people right across the business thinking about the questions rather than just getting through the questionnaire as quickly as possible, or sometimes even ignoring it. But that's going to generate a lot of data that can be hard to work with. We've heard that many times. It's always going to be difficult, isn't it?
It is. So the visualization of it is important. So obviously the last thing you want to do is go through this sort of approach, especially if you're getting hundreds of results from reaching out into the organization and asking stakeholders, what do you do with all of this data that comes in? Do you just end up with a large spreadsheet that you then have to do something with? So it is important to think through what sort of tool you're going to actually use to visualize the data and show the results in a way that highlights quite quickly what it is you need to focus on. So we won't go into this now, but if any of you would like more information on how our Thinking Board system actually helps you with this, obviously we would be very pleased to give you a demo. And just as another example of how it does that, is this other report that is automatically produced by the system, which we talk about as a heat map. This very simple example you've got here is just showing how across a series of question areas, the results from different parts of a global organization actually compare, and using a traffic light system, you can actually home in on the areas where there might be a problem. But our Thinking Board system actually allows drill down diagnosis, so that once you have spotted an area where you're not feeling very comfortable, you can actually drill down from that and get into the detail, find out what the actual problem area is, do comparisons between one country and another. If you see one area struggling around a particular aspect of risk management effectiveness, for example, you can compare it with one where it's working well and see what they're doing differently, and look at the comments that have been made around that. So all in all, it just helps you drill down to the root of the problem. So you can focus your resources and prioritize your efforts on those areas needing particular help, but also gives a lot more assurance to the committee as to how widely across the organization there is confidence, but also highlighting where there might be some weaknesses in a complex structure that need to be addressed. Because as everybody knows, and committees certainly know, that problems typically arise from some corner of the organisation rather arising from head office. So this is one way of just helping reach out into the rest of the organisation and see what's going on.
Richard, thanks very much. Everybody, thank you. We hope to this point, there's not much left to go, that we've given you some ideas around how value can be added by the audit, risk and compliance activities, and how from a self-assessment point of view you can overcome some of the well understood, if you like, or widely recognised at least, downsides of questionnaires. We're going to rerun the poll. This will just be quite interesting, and I'm hopefully going to rerun the poll now, just to see again from what we've done so far whether or not anything's changed. And if you could look at the poll now and give us your responses, that would be very helpful. Okay, the results are coming in. Thank you.
Well, actually, this is quite reassuring. So when we've run this sort of poll before, we've actually found that people's opinion change as we go through. But now, actually, 60% of you are satisfied that what you're doing is okay, and there's only about 35% of you feeling you could do a lot more. So that's good news.
Yeah, that's we're not here to try and poke holes in things. We're just trying to help if we can. In the time remaining, we've got some questions. Richard, I'll do the decent thing by asking you the questions and see where we go. I mean, I also might be able to answer some of them. So the first one is, what sort of response rates have you seen from clients from using their own system to using the one that we've just been showing? Any improvements, upsides, downsides?
I would say that generally it's about, you get quite a good response, about 80%. I mean, I think if you get the message and the positioning of the questionnaire right, people understand that it is important and it can actually add value to the business, then often you will get a good response. People like being asked, do you find risk management useful? Does it add value to what you do? Do you find internal audit useful? Etc. Those sort of questions actually are quite willing to engage with, because it does actually make a difference. And finally they say, oh, finally I'm being asked my opinion. I spend all this time with internal auditors, I spend all this time trying to follow risk management processes, and here finally I've got an opportunity to actually give my view. So I think as long as you make it clear that it is being done to actually ask what they think, what their opinion is, then often you do get good engagement levels.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good to hear. However, the self-assessments are being run. We've got a question here about the timing and the order of this sort of thing. Have you got any sort of thoughts or views on when's a good time and what sort of sequence these self-assessments can be done?
Well, I think two angles to that. One is clearly it makes sense for certain reviews to be done at certain times of year. So the external audit effectiveness review, for example, it makes sense to do that when the end year audit processes are still fresh in people's minds. So if you assume the audit is finishing, for example, in January for the December year-end company, it's no point in leaving the external audit effectiveness review until July, August, because people will have forgotten. So it does need doing quite quickly after that. So other, such as risk management effectiveness, are part of the internal control and risk management reporting cycle. It may be that it has to be done at a particular time of year. So when you report in the annual report on that assessment, that's just recently been done as well. Not so time sensitive, because you could have done it a few months earlier. But the other aspect I would say though is making sure these things are spread out, because often you've got the questionnaire going out to the same people, and the last thing people want is these to be bunched together. Much better to do one aspect every quarter, for example, or something like that, so that it's spread across the course of the year.
Thank you. Right, this is.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we've got one or two left. This one's, I'm sort of paraphrasing it a bit, around the questions you use each time. any views around using the same ones to get the trending, or taking a different approach?
I think it depends a bit on what comes out of the first review you get. I mean, obviously there are benefits to seeing how opinions have changed. You can assess progress or things becoming less effective, and so obviously in order to monitor that, the question really does need to be the same each time. Having said that, though, you might find after the first exercise that there's a whole area where people are so content, so confident that things are working well. Often it's going to be around process, that asking that every year probably doesn't make sense, but so you could drop that set of questions in the following year. But I think the area is more around opinion, behaviors, how people are actually using things, using risk management or encountering internal audit, etc., on a day-to-day basis. They're the ones which are more likely to change because the nature of the business is changing. So you probably do need to pick up those more regularly.
Okay, last one. It just says external benchmarking ? Sounds a bit leading, but we might as well address this right now.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing a lot more thinking at the moment around external benchmarking of effectiveness. I mean, it is a little bit complicated because obviously all your benchmarking is self-assessment. You're not necessarily benchmarking factual outcomes or results. But what we've done now is built into our thinking board system the ability to provide externally benchmarked information so organizations can compare themselves with others. And we're now starting to build up some of that data. So it's a real question of watch this space really on that front. Hopefully in about a year's time, we'll have a reasonable amount of good data from the new external benchmarking tool that we have built in to share that with subscribers.
Okay, last question, then we'll just leave you with our contact details. It says, please can you give an example of how you should describe expectations on risk within the business?
Well, I think one example I would say is, how do you actually translate the risk appetite statement into something that's meaningful? So I hope I've understood your question here, but very often when you see a risk appetite statement, it looks somewhat theoretical and almost forced often, and doesn't necessarily tie in very well to the strategy or tie in very well to what people are actually managing on a day-to-day basis. So I think you need to stand back from the risk appetite statement and say, okay, well, for this to be understood in the organization, how do I need to express it and how do I need to communicate it? Obviously, you're not expecting everybody across the organization to understand the risk appetite or have an application for it. But certainly as you go down from the executive through the senior manager and down to some of the management roles, you would expect it to be a live framework within which they're operating. So there's no point in describing it in a theoretical compliancy way, tied into what they are actually doing, and then that should work a lot better.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Our time is just about up. So we've left our contact details on the screen. Do please make a note. We'll be sending this out anyway, but it just remains for us to thank everybody for joining us. We hope that you found it interesting, helpful, and we'd of course be delighted to pick this up personally. Just let us know. Richard, thank you also.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.